The morning of March 14th, 1991 arrived gray and cold across the lower fields of Bream Farm on Route 879 in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. The temperature at first light was 28 degrees. Walter Bream, 61 years old, was out by 6:30 the way he always was. He had on the same canvas work jacket he'd been wearing since 1983, the collar darkened by years of sweat and engine grease, the left cuff repaired twice with a leather patch. His boots were rubber-soled and cracked along the instep, but waterproof still, which was what mattered in March. He moved through the corn stubble of the east field slowly, the frozen stalks clicking against his legs, the ground hard beneath the shallow inch of snowmelt that had pooled overnight. He was checking the drainage tiles along the east fence line. He checked them every March, after the ground began to soften. It was the kind of task that looks like nothing, a man walking a fence in the cold, but Walter had been doing it for 38 years, and he understood that the drainage system was not incidental to the farm. It was the farm's circulatory system. You had to pay attention to it the way a doctor pays attention to a patient's pulse, regularly, systematically, without drama. He was a man who did not hurry. He had learned soil the way surgeons learn anatomy, not from a single course, but from decades of daily contact with the real thing, from paying attention to what most people walked over without noticing. He knew this land by texture, by color, by the particular way it smelled after rain. He knew which acres drained slow, which held moisture into July, which ran sandy enough to need an extra inch of compost in October. He knew the yield variation by half-acre. He had grown grain corn and soybeans on this land since 1953, when he was 23 years old and his father was 55 and still working the upper fields with a purpose that excluded conversation. You watched Harold Bream. You did not ask him to explain. Walter was 60 feet from the east drainage ditch when he saw the color of the water. He stopped walking. It was not the color of anything he had seen come off this land in 38 years. It was pale amber, almost orange, with a faint, iridescent shimmer where the morning light caught it, the way oil shimmers on a puddle in a parking lot. It moved slowly through the ditch, thickening near the low end where the tile outlet sat. Where it pooled around the concrete collar of the outlet pipe, a thin, oily film had settled on the surface. He crouched down and put 2 fingers in, cold. He brought them to his nose. Sulfur. And something else beneath the sulfur. Something dry and sharp, like the air inside a machine shop where metal is being cut. He stood up and looked north. Through the bare tree line at the property's upper edge, he could see the gray roofline of the Westfield Chemical Processing Facility. 2¼ miles away, uphill, upstream. He looked back at the water. He looked at it for a long time. Walter Harold Bream was born in October 1999 on the same 180 acres where he now stood. He was the third of 4 sons born to Harold Ernest Bream, who had come to Clearfield County in 1911 from Westphalia, in the Ruhr Valley of Germany, where his own father had farmed within 4 miles of some of the densest industrial land in Central Europe. Harold had grown up watching the relationship between industrial land in Central Europe. Harold had grown up watching the relationship between industrial production and agriculture, the slow, corrosive drift of pollutants from steel mills and coal processing plants into the streams and fields that fed families. He had watched neighboring farms fail. He had watched a few of them survive by doing things differently than everyone else. Harold ran the Clearfield farm for 41 years. His heart gave out in December 1971, in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 62 years old. By the time he died, Walter had worked alongside him for 22 of those years and had absorbed the man's approach to farming the way children absorb a language, not by studying it, but by living inside it daily until it becomes the way you think. Harold Bream was not a man who explained himself. He showed you things. He walked you to the problem and stood there in silence until you arrived at his conclusion by your own route. It was a form of teaching that required patience from the student, and most people did not have that kind of patience. Walter had always had it. But Harold did say one thing, out loud in words, that Walter never forgot. It was September of 1969. Walter was 39 years old. They were walking the north fence line after a heavy September rain and the drainage from the neighboring property. A man named Durfield, who used commercial lawn chemicals on 3 acres of ornamental grass around his house, was running off the fence line in a thin, bright stream. Harold stopped and looked at it. He stood there for a moment. "The water carries what the land needs," he said. His English still had the careful construction of a man who had learned it in middle age. "Even bad water. The question is, what you do in between." Then he kept walking. Walter had thought about those words many times over the following 2 decades. He had filed them in that place where old people's wisdom goes, acknowledged, respected, and not yet understood. He had never needed them, not like this, not with a real answer required. What most people in Clearfield County knew about Walter Bream was that he was a quiet, consistent farmer. He grew grain corn and soybeans on 188 acres of river-bottom ground and produced reliable yields without drama. He used his 1974 John Deere 4430 the same way he used every piece of equipment, carefully, without hurrying, and for a long time. He did not modernize for the sake of modernizing. He repaired what broke. He bought what was necessary. His farm showed a profit every year for 38 years, and not one of those years made anyone wealthy. What most people did not know was that Walter held a certificate in soil science from Penn State's continuing education program, earned by correspondence in 1961 while running the farm full-time. He had never mentioned it. He also had his father's 12 notebooks, ledger-sized, cloth-bound, written partly in German and partly in English across 40 years of observation about the particular soil on that particular 180 acres. Walter had read them all by 1975 and kept them in the cabinet beside the kitchen window, behind the row of seed catalogs. He would need both of those things now. Westfield Chemical Processing had operated its facility 2.3 miles north of Bream Farm since 1978. The plant processed industrial solvents for commercial manufacturing clients, primarily trichloroethylene used in metal degreasing and zinc-based compounds used in galvanizing operations. It was not a large facility. 63 employees. A single processing building and 2 storage tank farms set on 41 acres of fenced industrial property at the top of a long drainage slope that ran, in wet conditions, directly toward the lower fields of the farms below it. Westfield had received 2 notice of violation letters from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection in 1986 and again in 1989. Both concerned improper secondary containment protocols around the liquid waste handling area. Both times, the company had paid the fines, between $8,000 and $12,000 each, adjusted its paperwork, and continued operating. The regional manager was a man named David Calloway. He was 44 years old, held an MBA from Duquesne University, and had been running Westfield's Pennsylvania operations for 7 years. He was not a careless man. He was a man who measured problems by their regulatory dimensions and managed them accordingly. He had handled the 2 debt violations correctly, within the system, by the system's rules, and he believed that this was what responsible management looked like. Walter drove his 1987 Ford F-150 to Westfield's front office on the morning of March 17th. He had spent the 3 days between his discovery and this meeting collecting 6 water samples in clean glass mason jars, labeled by date and GPS coordinates he'd taken with a handheld unit borrowed from his son. He had already dropped them at PHL Environmental Laboratories in Harrisburg, driven the 3 hours round trip himself, and paid the $340 analysis fee in cash. The receptionist sent him back without much of a wait. Calloway stood and offered his hand and offered coffee, which Walter declined. They sat down. "Your secondary containment failed," Walter said. "The freeze-thaw cycle last week opened up the east berm." I've contaminated water running through my east drainage ditch, and I have 3 to 4 inches of it ponded across my lower 40 acres. Calloway's expression was the expression of a man who recognized this situation and had a procedure for it. Mr. Bream, I appreciate you coming in directly. We did have a minor berm integrity issue during the thaw. We've already got a crew on it, but I want to be responsible here before we draw conclusions about source. Your property is, what, 2 miles south? 2.3, Walter said. Right. There are other drainage contributors in that corridor. Before we establish any causal connection, our environmental team would need to. I have lab results coming back by Friday, Walter said. I expect they'll show zinc sulfate and trichloroethylene at concentrations consistent with your processing waste profile. Calloway looked at him for a moment, then he leaned back slightly. If there is a demonstrated connection, we would of course want to be part of a remediation conversation, he said. But these processes take time to properly assess, and our legal team would need to be involved at that point. How much of my corn season do you think proper assessment takes up? Walter said. Calloway did not answer. He offered the kind of smile that professionals learn to deploy in difficult meetings. Attentive, non-committal, managerial. Walter stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Calloway's hand, which was warm and smooth. He drove home in 31 minutes along Route 879. The fields were still gray and cold on both sides of the road. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time without taking his jacket off. The lab results came back on March 22nd. Zinc at 40 Wends per liter. The EPA's agricultural use limit was 2-0, 40 wethylene. At trace to second the zinc, at 40 Wends per liter. The EPA's agricultural use limit was 2-thiol-wem. Iron and manganese at concentrations that would, if left unaddressed, progressively bind the phosphorus in his soil into insoluble compounds, reducing its availability to crops for 2 to 3 growing seasons. The lower 40 acres were, in the careful language of the report, unsuitable for crop production in current condition. He looked at the results. He looked at the 12 notebooks in the cabinet by the window. He pulled out the 6th one and opened it to a section he had read once, in 1973, and not returned to since. He spent the next 6 weeks reading with a focus that his wife Ruth noticed but did not disturb. She was 58 years old. She brought him coffee in the evenings and left it on the corner of the table. She did not ask what he was working on. What Walter was working on was this: an understanding of whether living plants, specifically the common cattail, Typha latifolia, and a selection of willows and reed grasses, could, arranged in a deliberate system with controlled water residence time, strip sufficient zinc and industrial solvent residue from contaminated water to bring it within agricultural use standards. The science was not new. German researchers had documented constructed wetland treatment of industrial runoff as early as the 1920s. His father's 6th notebook referenced such a system used by farmers near the Bochum Steel District, a 3-stage reed bed arrangement, hand-dug, clay-lined, planted with indigenous wetland vegetation. The estimated reduction in heavy metal concentration across a 90-day residence cycle had been documented at between 60 and 80%. Modern remediation firms offered chemical neutralization, soil excavation, and replacement. The 3 proposals Walter had received by May 1991 ranged from $189,000 to $261,000, with timelines of 1 to 2 years and no guarantee on long-term soil productivity. He put all 3 proposals in a folder and did not open the folder again. He drove to State College in the last week of April and found Dr. the folder again. He drove to State College in the last week of April and found Dr. Danta. Raymond Ochsner, 72 years old, Professor Emeritus of Environmental Soil Science at Penn State's College of Agricultural Sciences. Ochsner had published a paper in 1974 in the Journal of Environmental Quality on passive phytoremediation systems, one of the earliest English-language treatments of the subject in American agricultural science. He had retired in 1983. He lived on Nittany Avenue in a white house with a backyard full of soil test plots. He answered his own door. Walter showed him the PHL lab results and the relevant pages from his father's notebook. Oxner read both without speaking. He read the lab results for 2 minutes and the notebook pages for 5. Zinc at 4.8, trichloroethylene trace, Oxner said finally. You don't have a catastrophic contamination problem. Walter said, you have a zinc problem, Walter, biological answer. Oxner put the papers down on the kitchen table and looked at them. Typha latifolia will uptake zinc at those concentrations through root absorption. You'd need adequate residence time, 45 to 60 days per stage, minimum, 3-stage system. Clay-lined. I put willows on the perimeter of your final stage. The root system adds a secondary filtration layer. Inside 2 growing seasons, you could bring that output water below 1.5 milligrams per liter. Possibly sooner. That's close to what my father's notebook describes, Walter said. Oxner looked at the notebook. Where did he see this? Near Bochum. Before he left Germany. Oxner was quiet for a moment. The Germans were doing this in the 1920s, he said. No one here took it seriously until the late 1970s, he said. No one here took it seriously until the late 1970s. And then everyone wanted to speed it up. You can't speed it up. That's the entire point of it. He wrote Walter a 2-page technical letter. Methodological recommendations, species selection, clay lining specifications, water intake design. He charged nothing for it. He would say later, in a 1997 Penn State alumni newsletter interview, that Walter Bream was the only person who had ever come to him with the solution already formed and wanted only confirmation that he was not wrong. Walter went home and did the math on 14 sheets of yellow legal pad. The numbers were straightforward. He needed 12 acres of his lowest, wettest ground. The acres that were already damaged and unusable, arranged in 3 sequential settling ponds. He would need 2,200 cattail rhizomes for the first 2 stages, and 44 weeping willow rootstock for the perimeter of stage 3. Clay for the pond linings was available on the property, from a low deposit on the far western edge that he had known about since 1958. He would dig the ponds himself with his father's 1966 Case 580 backhoe. Total estimated cash cost $30,180. He drew the system in pencil on graph paper, 3 rectangles, the intake channel, the outfall, the dimensions and the margins. He pinned it to the wall behind the kitchen door. He told no one what he was building. He started digging on the 6th of May, 1991. The ground had softened enough to work. He used the Case 580 for the bulk excavation and a D-handle spade for the clay lining work, which required precision. The first pond, 140 feet long, 40 feet wide, 3.5 feet deep, took 11 days. He dug it alone, morning to dark, with a half-hour break at noon. He was 61 years old. He had been doing physical work since he was 12. His neighbor, Gus Partridge, stopped by on a Thursday afternoon in early June. Gus was 55, farmed 220 acres of feed corn a half-mile east on Route 879 and had watched Walter's excavation from the road for 3 days before curiosity overcame him. He parked his International Harvester pickup beside the barn and walked out to the pond site. Building a pond? Gus asked. 3 of them, Walter said. He didn't stop working. Gus looked at the shape of the first excavation. He looked east toward the still discolored ground of the lower fields. He worked a toothpick to the other side of his mouth. Walt, DEP has programs for what happened to you. Remediation fund. I know a contractor over in Punxsutawney who does this kind of work. Good fella, he knows what he's doing. I know, Walter said. You're going to plant cattails in there. Yes, in what used to be corn ground. For a while, Walter said. You're going to plant cattails in there. Yes, in what used to be corn ground. For a while, Walter said. Gus was quiet. He looked at the expediac. He said nothing else, and he drove away, and the silence of his departure was its own assessment of the situation. By October of 1991, all 3 ponds were dug, clay-lined and receiving continuous slow flow from the contaminated drainage channel. Walter had installed a simple wooden intake baffle at the head of Stage 1 to slow the inflow and allow initial settlement. He had planted the 2,200 cattail rhizomes across Stages 1 and 2 sourced from a wetland restoration supplier in Erie County at $0.38 seeds and set the 44 weeping willows in a staggered perimeter row around Stage 3. 1-year bare rootstock at $1.10 seed. He had done all the planting himself over 9 days in late September. Spring of 1992, the cattails had established through the winter and were sending up new growth, 6 inches, then 18, then 4 feet by June. The water entering Stage 1 still ran amber in the morning light. The water leaving Stage 3 was noticeably clearer, a pale yellow rather than orange. Walter collected samples every 2 weeks and drove them to the lab in Harrisburg. June 1992, zinc output from Stage 3 read 3.1 milligrams per liter. Still above the agricultural limit of 2.0, still moving in the right direction. Gus Partridge drove by one afternoon in August 1992 and slowed his truck to look at the cattail stands, which were now 5 feet tall and dense across both first stage ponds. He did not stop. He kept going east down Route 879. The lawsuit Walter's attorney, Thomas Griswold of Clearfield had filed against Westfield Chemical Processing in September 1999, moved through the system at the speed these things move. Depositions in the winter of 1992. Expert testimony preparation through the spring. In February 1993, Westfield's attorneys offered a settlement, $118,000, no admission of fault, full release of liability. Walter accepted. He put $112,000 into the farm operating account and spent $6,000 upgrading the intake structure on Stage 1 and purchasing an additional 600 cattail rhizomes for a section of Stage 2 that had established poorly over the first winter. He told Ruth about the settlement on a Tuesday evening after supper. "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. Spring of 1993. The zinc readings on Stage 3 output water had dropped to 1.9 milligrams per liter, below the EPA agricultural use threshold of 2.0 for the first time. Walter walked to the Stage 3 outfall on an April morning and watched the water run clear over the gravel bed he had laid the previous autumn. He crouched down and looked at the surface. No film, no sheen. The water ran the color of water. He stood up and walked back to the barn. He had the hydraulic lift on the John Deere to check before the week was out. In September of 1993, the lab results Walter had been working toward for 2.5 years came back from Harrisburg. Stage 3 output, zinc at 1.4 milligrams per liter. Trichloroethylene, non-detect. Iron and manganese within normal agricultural range. The water was clean enough to use. More than clean, the accumulation of mineral sediment stripped from the contaminated water, zinc compounds, iron deposits, organic matter produced by the breakdown of cattail root material had been redirecting in small amounts into the east irrigation channel each time Walter had used the filtered output water for supplemental irrigation. The formerly devastated lower 40 acres now showed, according to a Penn State Extension soil test completed in August 1993, a pH of 6.8, organic matter at 4.1%, up from 2.6% before the contamination event, and a micronutrient profile that the Extension Soil Lab described in its written report as unusually rich for river-bottom sandy loam, consistent with active organic amendment. The field that Westfield Chemical Processing had ruined was now, measurably, better ground than it had been in March 1991. Walter read the report twice, slowly. He put it in a manila folder and filed it in a cabinet next to his father's notebooks. He went out to the east field and crouched down and picked up a handful of the soil from the lower acreage. It was dark, darker than it had been. It crumbled through his fingers in the way that good soil crumbles, not in clods, not in dry fragments, but in a clean, organic fall. He could smell it. the particular richness of soil that is biologically active. He set his hand down. He stood up. He went back inside and told Ruth what the soil test said. She set down the book she was reading. She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Your father would have said something about that," she said. "He already did," Walter said. "In 1969, in the spring of 1994, he planted soybeans on 40 of the formerly damaged acres. Those 40 acres yielded 54 bushels per acre at harvest. The Clearfield County average that year was 38. Word does not travel quickly in Clearfield County. It moves the way it always has, through feed store conversations, along fence lines, across the table at the Phillipsburg Grange meeting on the second Thursday of the month. By winter of 1994, people knew that Walter Bream had done something unusual with the contaminated water on his east side. By spring of 1995, people were talking about the yield numbers, which did not make sense for a field that had been under industrial waste 4 years earlier. Gus Partridge came by on a Thursday morning in April of 1995. He parked beside the barn and walked out to where Walter was pulling soil cores in the east field. He stood and watched for a minute. Then he looked at the 3 settling ponds, the cattail stands now 4 years old and dense, the willows along stage 3 now standing 12 feet tall. "Those numbers I heard," Gus said. 54 on beans, on the east 40. "Yes," Walter said. Gus looked at the stage 3 outfall where the water ran clear and steady into the gravel channel. He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't think it would work," he said. He wasn't making excuses. It was a plain statement of what had been true. "I know," Walter said. "How'd you know it would?" Walter thought about his father. September 1969. The fence line. The thin, bright stream of Durfield's lawn chemicals running into the ditch. "I didn't," Walter said. "I just knew it was worth the time to find out." A graduate student named Karen Sollenberger from Penn State's Department of Agronomy arrived at Bream Farm in June of 1995, following a tip from Dr. Mar-Aller Rind of 1995, following a tip from Dr. Raymond Oxna, who had been following Walter's biannual lab results through informal correspondence for 4 years. Sollenberger spent 2 days taking water samples at each stage of the filtration system, pulling soil cores from the restored acreage, and documenting the plant species composition and density of the reed beds. Her findings were published in November 1995 in the Journal of Environmental Quality, the same publication where Oxner had published in 1974 under the title Passive Phytoremediation of Zinc-Contaminated Agricultural Water, a case study in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. Walter Bream was listed as a secondary contributor. He had specifically requested he not be the primary subject. The County Extension Office asked for a site visit in January 1996. Walter agreed. 14 people came, extension agents, a DEP field officer, 2 university researchers, and several neighboring farmers. Walter walked them through the system for 40 minutes. He answered every question they asked. He declined to be photographed. He was back in the barn by noon. David Calloway had left Westfield Chemical Processing in 1993, taking a regional director role with Allegheny Environmental Consultants in Pittsburgh. His colleagues understood the move as a promotion. Calloway understood it as a clean break from an episode he had not handled well. In his new role, he managed remediation contracts at contaminated agricultural and industrial sites across western Pennsylvania. By 1996, he had overseen the failure of conventional chemical remediation at 4 of those sites, where the timelines had run 2 to 3 times overestimate and the soil productivity results had fallen short of projections by significant margins. He read Karen Sollenberger's paper when it was published. He read it twice. He drove out to Bream Farm on a Wednesday morning in March of 1996. He did not call ahead. He pulled into the farm lane and parked beside the barn. Walter came out from underneath the John Deere, wiping his hands on a red rag. He looked at the truck. He recognized Calloway immediately. Calloway looked older. He was holding his hat in both hands. "I should have called," Calloway said. "Come inside," Walter said. Ruth put 2 cups of coffee on the kitchen table without being asked and went to the other room. Calloway sat down. His eyes went to the graph paper plan pinned to the wall behind the kitchen door. 3 rectangles in pencil. The dimensions in the margins, the intake and outfall channels sketched in careful lines. He looked at it for a long moment. "I owe you an apology that should have come 5 years ago," Calloway said. He did not qualify it. He did not attach an explanation to it. "What we did to your land was wrong. What happened at that meeting in 1991, the way I handled your visit, was worse. I managed it as a liability problem. You came in with contaminated water on your fields, and I was thinking about documentation procedures." Walter waited. "I read the Penn State paper," Calloway said. "I've been watching your extension office reports since the fall. I know what the yield numbers look like on that east acreage." He set his coffee down. "I'm working 17 contaminated farm sites across the state right now, mostly chemical remediation. At least 4 of them are not going to work. The timelines are wrong, the costs are wrong, and the soil when we're done isn't what it was before." He paused. "What you built out here is not in any of our remediation protocols." "No," Walter said. "I'd like to bring a technical team out. They wanted to document the system properly, with your permission." Calloway looked at the graph paper on the wall again. "How long did you know this would work?" "I didn't know it would work," Walter said. "I knew the principle was sound. Your father, his notebook was sound." "Your father, his notebook." Calloway was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pencil plan. The whole system, 3 ponds, 2 species of plants, 1 drainage slope, 180 acres saved, laid out on a single sheet of graph paper in the handwriting of a 61-year-old farmer who had once been told by his father that bad water still carries what the land needs. "You could have taken our first settlement offer and hired a contractor," Calloway said. "I could have," Walter said. He refilled Calloway's coffee. The documentation project Allegheny Environmental Consultants undertook with Walter Bream's cooperation ran from the summer of 1996 through the spring of 1998. By the time it concluded, the Bream phytoremediation model had been applied in modified form at 11 contaminated farm sites across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. At 7 of those sites, the filtered wastewater was actively used for supplemental irrigation within 3 growing seasons of system installation. Average total cost per site, $6,400. Average cost of the failed conventional remediation projects at comparable sites, $189,000. By $1999, 23 farms in 4 states were operating passive reed bed filtration systems based on the Clearfield County model. Total acreage returned to productive use, 140 Weniquarid. The Journal of Environmental Quality published a follow-up study in 2001, with Walter listed as primary contributor. He had agreed, reluctantly, after 3 separate requests from Oxner and Sollenberger combined. In the spring of 2000, David Calloway gave a keynote address at the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau's annual environmental conference in Harrisburg. He stood at a podium in front of 340 people, farmers, DEP officials, extension agents, university researchers, and told the story of March 14, 1991. He told it from the beginning. He did not skip the part about the meeting in his office, or the liability calculation, or the managerial smile. He did not make himself a better character than he had been. Walter Bream drove 2 hours round trip to Harrisburg to pay for his own lab analysis, Calloway said. He came to my office 3 days later with documentation I wasn't prepared to engage with seriously. I treated it as a liability event. He treated it as a liability event. He treated it as a liability event. He treated it as a liability. The difference between those 2 framings is the difference between a $47,000 settlement and 1,140 acres of restored farmland. He paused. The knowledge that we stored those acres came from a notebook written by a German farmer in the Ruhr Valley in the 1930s. Walter Breem's father carried that notebook from Westphalia to Clearfield County in 1911. Walter kept it for 20 years and understood what was in it. Not one person in any regulatory body, remediation firm, or university extension program in this state, including me, thought to ask what the farmer already knew. He stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. Then they clapped. Walter had been invited to the conference. He had sent a politely worded letter of decline in January. He was in Clearfield County. The field corn needed to go in. The east field on Breem Farm in the spring of 2001 looks from the road like ordinary farmland. The rows are straight and dark. The soil turns cleanly behind the plow. The corn will go in next week, the same as every year. What you cannot see from Route 879 is the water. The Stage 3 outfall still runs clear through the gravel bed and into the east irrigation channel, the same way it has run every day since October 1993. The cattail stands are 10 years old now, dense and upright in the April wind. The willows along the perimeter of Stage 3 have reached 30 feet. In the early morning, when the light comes low and flat across the lower fields, the ponds catch it in a particular way. A flat, still silver that does not look like anything remarkable unless you know what is underneath it and what it replaced. Walter is 71 years old. He moves a little slower than he did when he dug those ponds with a Case 580 and a D-handle spade. The canvas jacket has been replaced, finally. The new one is the same weight and the same color. He still walks the east drainage tiles every March. He still walks the east drainage tiles every March. He still runs the 1974 John Deere 4430. It needed a new hydraulic pump in 1998 and a fuel injector in the winter of 2000. But it runs the same as it always did, which is to say, correctly. His daughter-in-law brought her youngest boy to the farm on a Sunday afternoon in late April. The boy was 9 years old. He stood at the edge of Stage 1 and looked at the cattails and looked at the water. "Why do you grow plants in the water?" he asked. Walter looked at the cattail stands. He looked at the water moving slow and clear from stage to stage. He looked at the willows, which his father had never seen and which were older now than some of the farmers who came to study them. "Because the water carries what the land needs," he said, "even bad water. The question is what you do in between." The boy thought about that. Walter walked back to the barn. He had the air filter on the John Deere to check before the week was out, and the lower 40 would need one more soil test before planting. There was work to do. There was always work to do. He had never wanted recognition. He had wanted his fields back. He had gotten both, which was more than he planned for and less than some people would have settled for, and exactly the right amount. The thing about old knowledge is that it does not expire. It waits. It sits in a notebook in a cabinet by the kitchen window, in a language half remembered, and it waits for the moment when the problem it was made to solve finally arrives. It does not announce itself. It does not argue for its relevance. It is simply there, patient and quiet, in the way that all real things are patient and quiet. And when the time comes, it works.